Okay, it's recording. Welcome to the Flux Dev Meeting, July 2nd, 2025. Hey, so I'm gonna start again now that we can record. I'm gonna give some quick updates on that release we released last Friday. So we released Flux 2.6.3 with a fix for negotiation of SHA-2 host key algorithms. We had a regression introduced in 2.6.2, and we fixed it in 2.6.3 with an integration test with Azure DevOps that shows this won't happen again. So it's a test that could have caught the issue, and now we have it. So yeah, we released this on last Friday, and next I can probably give some updates on the roadmap and ongoing efforts and contributions. So we are planning to make the image APIs generally available in Flux 2.7. With that, I open an issue for tracking minor improvements that we need to do for these APIs before they go GA. So better kubectl aliases, columns when printing, like with kubectl get. Also removing deprecated code paths and things like that. And so we found a few contributors that are helping us with that, which is really great. Like 2 or 3 people are working on these minor issues. So it's really great that we have help from this many people at the same time. And also one of them is also contributing a wider change with how actually a topic that was brought up by Lee. So the way we handle secrets across Flux is not very consistent at the moment. And this person stepped in and contributed for us a library for handling secrets in the package repo, and is now integrating this library everywhere. They just started in the notification controller. They already actually got a PR merged for deprecating the proxy configuration for the provider API that is not conforming with how we handle proxy everywhere else in Flux. So now it is. We introduced the new field for that, spec.proxy secret ref. We deprecated spec.proxy and the proxy key inside the spec.secret ref, and have now an error log being printed if people are using that. And before the provider API goes GA in V1, we will remove those deprecated fields. And so now the library contributed from this person. Their name is Shu Kutsuzawa. So Shu contributed the library, already integrated it for proxy and notification controller, and is now right now I'm actually was actually reviewing a PR for introducing MTLS for the provider API as well, which was actually the original reason why Lee brought this discussion up. So for your information, Lee, they're introducing MTLS for the provider API. If you were actually looking for any particular providers, like I don't know, LEC or whatever, they are introducing the feature for a subset, and more or less how for a bit less of the providers are still not being supported in the PR. So I'm asking them to document which providers are going to be supporting this PR or release and which ones are not. If the one you actually need is in the list of the ones that are not, it's probably a good idea for you to let us know which provider it is so we can ask him to cover that one.
I think in this instance, the folks I was talking to who we're using a sidecar with notification controller for their use case. We're using the generic webhook provider for a custom integration with an internal web server. So
The
um,
generic webhook provider. Wait, so is that wait, generic webhook? Let me check the docs one second. Generic webhook. Yeah, the first one, right? Okay. I'll make sure that one gets the feature.
yeah,
Yeah.
this I think would be probably the most common case where MTLS is required in an organization
Yeah,
because
yeah.
whatever
Makes
reasons.
sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Cool. Let me check.
I guess I could also see this maybe being used with like Istio or something. Um, kind of a weird one, but
What the heck? Where's the switch case that creates the generic notifier? Yeah, yeah, okay. Is this one using TLS? Yes, it's using TLS. Great. Yeah, this one is covered. It's because we have this like internal abstraction where the post provider, right, which is an HTTP post, and we use it for many of the providers. So that's the one he focused the PR on, and there's a few others to go. But great, yes. So we have that. They are also looking into well, adding the library everywhere else in all the other controllers and also the Flux CLI. And this person already contributed. So I'm actually, when they finish this work, I am going to invite them to become a member of the project because that's a lot already they did. Like in less than 1 month, they contributed so much, and they just upgraded, customized to 5.7 everywhere, including a regression test for a panic. So when, if I remember correctly, when you were using customize to delete multiple objects, you know, like if you had a patch or a couple of patches to remove two objects, uh, customize would panic. This was fixed in customize 5.7, and they had a PR open with a test uh, for this regression, for this bug fix. And we're just waiting for Customize to be released. And now that Customize is released, they bumped everywhere and merged their test, which is great. So yeah, lots of contributions. There's one more person who was also helping with the minor improvements for the image APIs before they go GA. They also fixed, or you can call it a feature as well, like in Kubernetes 131, Kubernetes started validating the CA bundle of a webhook for conversion in CRDs. So in a CRD object, you can specify a webhook for converting between versions. That webhook has a CA bundle field. That field would accept invalid CAs in Kubernetes 131. Kubernetes is no longer accepting invalid CAs there. Why would people add invalid CAs there? Because the cert manager exists and is actually working on the background to update that field to a valid value, right? So People, and that this was even, looks like this was even injected by default by QBuilder for a long time. So QBuilder would generate CRDs with an invalid CA bundle in that field. So it's worth on our side in Flux to fix this for everybody. It's a good UX improvement that Argo also shipped, so we have to ship it too. And so yeah, this PR is also merged. So now if you specify a CRD object with this invalid CA bundle field, what customized controller will do is it will remove the field if it's invalid. For the dry run, for applying, and the Flux CLI will also do that in Flux Div customization. So the behaviors now will be consistent everywhere. And so yeah, if the value is a valid CA, customized controller keeps it. And if it's invalid, customized controller removes it. So people's setups are broken by this breaking change from Kubernetes 131. So there's that. There's also we have an issue from Eric, the cert manager maintainer. He actually started a thread with Kubernetes maintainers to ask about this. So he says he has a problem with Flux for a long time when applying in cluster role bindings and cluster roles in the same apply. So if you do this, what's the issue in Flux and the behavior of Kubernetes around this, right? So basically, Kubernetes allows the cluster admin identities to bypass these dry run checks. So if you do a dry run with a cluster role and the cluster role binding for this role, if you do a server-side dry run with cluster admin, this will pass. The dry run will not error out. And the default in customized controller is um, cluster admin, obviously, right? So that's why it usually works. But Eric wants um, to apply with a source account with impersonation, right? So, and this source account has permission to create both resources. The source account has RBAC for creating the cluster role and the cluster role binding. So the apply works. Why does the apply, but the dry run fails? The dry run fails and the apply works. Why is that? Because in dry run, by design, is not designed for to be transactional, right? So if also, I'm not sure if there's the concept of applying more than one object at the same time in server-side applying Kubernetes. So you actually do one by one, and because of that, because you did not persist the cluster role binding dry run check, which checks for the existence of the cluster role, fails because the cluster role was not persisting, right? So dry run fails, but apply works. If you do not do a dry run, customized controller would work for that because it sorts. It does, like, customized controller actually does have a list of resource of built-in resource types. I was checking these like this week. It does sort the objects in a reasonable order, so these things don't error out. But in dry run, because it's not cluster admin, the dry run fails and everything. So There's this issue that we want to address as well. It's kind of a similar thing to how we fix the CA bundle thing, right? It's bad UX from Kubernetes that we can improve in Flux. So we will basically, we already have some stage. So besides sorting the objects in an order that makes sense for apply, customized controller and our server-side applied library also already have this stage concept where we do the dry runs in batches, and it applies as well. But like because we like separate these batches, for example, namespaces. So basically, it's actually a simple thing. We have three stages. The first stage is namespaces and CRDs. The second stage is class resources, like storage class and stuff like that. And the third stage is everything else. So namespaces and CRDs, classes, and everything else. Um, this way, because we apply each stage and then only do the dry run for the next stage after the previous stage has been applied, it this kind of thing can be solved, right? So for this specific problem, we can basically solve it by making the cluster role part of the first stage. So in the first stage, we apply namespaces, CRDs, and cluster roles. Then in the third stage, when we apply the cluster role binding, the dry run will not fail because the cluster roles are already applied, right? So this is something we can solve easily. I filed a PR I filed an issue for this. I filed also a PR in the roadmap in the website for adding this to Flux 2.7 as well.
What the issue is for that? I'm just taking notes.
Right. The issue is in the package repo. Let me grab the number. Um, so it's 956 SSA transactional apply for cluster roles and cluster role bindings. So yeah. Um, I guess, well, yeah, those are the updates from my end. I'm also working on, yeah, I talked about
Sorry,
everything.
I'm just seeing that there's also a similar issue for a class stage. Is this the same?
It's
Or
related. It's related. Yeah, I opened that issue for, because so that's the thing. Customized controller has these three classes I just talked about. Cluster definitions, which is namespaces and CRDs, class, and everything else. This three-stage separation exists only in customized controller codebase. In the package repo, we have a few functions that we use for the server-side apply. We have apply all and we have apply all staged. Customized controller uses apply all directly 3 times for the 3 stages. Apply all staged has 2 stages, namespaces and CRDs in the first stage and everything else in the second stage. So apply all staged needs to support the class stage to match the behavior from customized controller. So that issue is for that. That issue is for introducing the class stage in apply all staged. So this way we can make customized controllers stop calling apply all directly and start calling apply all staged instead. And that because in the other places where we use like there are the places where we use apply all staged that are doing this right now. So they would also benefit from this third the stage class in the middle. Uh just like customized controller, and customized controller can be simplified from that perspective. And we can also address all these sorts of ordering issues like the cluster role binding and cluster role issues just there in apply all staged, then we just bump package runtime everywhere. Sorry, server package server side apply everywhere, and we will get consistent behavior everywhere we use this server side apply library from that we have for Flux.
Yeah, that feels sensible. I wonder if it would also affect the CLI. We probably have some
Yeah,
staging for the Flux install.
yeah. So Flux install uses one of the two for sure. One of apply all staged or apply all. I did check that. I just forgot now which of the two, but you're right. That probably also affects the CLI
I can't
in this way.
see something like this breaking Flux install. Um, it feels definitely like a pretty big behavior change, and I know Stefan was also thinking about this as well. Um, but
Yeah.
it sounds like good behavior, honestly. Like that we've had,
Yeah, yeah, I don't think it's gonna break anything. It's just
everyone has
gonna,
always had to work around this by adding a depends on it, the separate customization.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
normally, if you don't have to do that for kubectl, then this could really be surprising. It's probably going to help a lot of people in migrations as well over the next decade. So
Mm. Yeah, so I'm checking here in the CLI, and in the CLI, we'll or like just rechecking this code I was looking at when I filed all these issues is they use apply all, so they don't have the stage thing apply all staged. Yeah, nothing in Flux to repo uses apply all staged. So when we change the behavior in this method, it won't affect the CLI, but uh, it could be using the predicate functions that decide which is which, maybe. Well, I don't think so because, like, I mean, there's a bunch of logic in the CLI for install to order things, so yeah, probably not. Yeah, I think it's safe. Like, I look at I found out also that we have a function called just apply besides apply all and apply all staged, which is for a single object. And the only production place where we use this method is in Helm controller when we apply the Helm chart from the Helm chart template in the Helm release, the old thing we don't want people to use. I and in a test in notification controller. So this function can probably be it. We should just use apply all everywhere. Yeah. Anyway, so we have that, and yeah, so these are all the updates involving other people and outside world. So now the update in workload identity. Uh, workload identity. This week I took the week to I made some time to work on remote cluster. So I just actually I opened a pull request in Flux2 repo to update the RFC 0010 for considering remote cluster access with workload identity. Remote cluster in this case is GKE, AKS, and EKS. Um, I opened a pull request to update the RFC, and I also opened a pull request to implement the feature in the package repo. And then after that, I'll need a pull request in Helm controller and customized controller to use the library. That's finally it from me, I guess.
You said GKE and EKS, Matheus?
GKE, AKS, and EKS. Yeah, the three cloud provider managed Kubernetes services.
And this is for clusters that are not in the cloud, but using the cloud provider's identity um,
Yeah,
provider.
it has to be so basically where the two main features we are using from cloud providers here are the fact that all of them support integration between their identity system, the IAM system, and the managed Kubernetes services. So basically, GCP service account can have RBAC in GKE, a managed identity can have RBAC in AKS, and an IAM role can have RBAC in EKS. So this is the first thing. And the other thing is the fact that we can use our cloud identity to acquire the credentials for the cloud identity, right? So we're combining the two things. With workload identity, we can provide IAM integrated access to managed Kubernetes services. This is
This
what
is
we are shipping.
this, this is basically always relying on the support for integrating arbitrary Kubernetes um, jot key servers with cloud provider IDs, right?
Uh, it's not necessarily based like I sorry, I think I didn't follow. So can you repeat the question?
This is always relying on the external clusters, JWKS, the key
The
server.
ex the external cluster JWKS. No, it's the opposite. It's the JWKS from the source cluster. The remote cluster is okay. So um the I have a cluster A running Flux and a cluster B where I want to apply things.
Oh,
Cluster
okay, okay.
cluster B is a managed service. And in this case, the credential comes from an identity in cluster A and not B.
Where the Flux cluster that is the applying controlling cluster.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that works either if it's controller level or object level workload identity. Let's say you configure customized controller service account to have a GCP service account. Then in spec.kubeconfig.provider, if you set that to GCP and the cluster resource name, so the minimum two fields. Okay, let me give an overview of the API. So in in both customization and Helm release APIs, we have this field called spec.kubeconfig, right? The only field inside spec.kubeconfig right now is spec.kubeconfig.secretRef. This secret ref has a static kubeconfig. We are introducing 4 new fields under spec.kubeconfig. Those 4 fields are provider, cluster, address, and service account name. The minimum required fields for spec.kubeconfig without using secret ref are provider and cluster. So provider is one of AWS, Azure, GCP, or generic. Generic is for secret ref and is the default. The other 3 are required if you want to use this feature. Cluster is the fully qualified resource name of the cluster in the Cloud API. So for Google, projects slash something slash location slash something slash cluster slash something. In EKS, it's the ARN of the EKS cluster. In Azure, it's the super long and complicated fully qualified resource name of an AKS cluster. So with these 2 fields provider and cluster, we have enough for authenticating. So in my example, if customized controller service account in the cluster is configured with a GCP service account, then if you set provider to GCP and cluster to the fully qualified cluster name in GCP, this allows you to use the GCP service account you associated with customized controller as an identity with RBAC in the target GKE cluster. The source, the source cluster where Flux is running can be anything, anything at all. Like it can be another GKE cluster, it can be EKS, it can be AKS, it can be bare metal, whatever. Like
This will by default use the service account of the controller unless service account name is passed.
yeah, it's like default controller level. Just imagine controller level workload identity as Flux always had, but
Yeah.
for talking to a instead of talking to a GCS bucket, I'm talking to a GK cluster that supports RBAC in that cluster for this cloud identity.
Yeah, I'm just specifically thinking about what the fields in the API mean, and how it could be
Oh yeah, I
interpreted
didn't explain the
differently.
other two, right? Yeah, I just talked about the
Because,
first two.
well, and it's like when service account name isn't supplied for other objects in the cluster or like customization and Helm release, if it's not applied, you still get a default behavior that's not controller level. So
You
then,
mean spec.source account name?
yeah,
Yeah, you get cluster admin from the controller.
no.
Yeah, if you wait, do you mean in the context of kubeconfig or not? Depends on.
And that's
So
what I'm
there's
getting at is
yeah,
like this is it's kind of like a we implemented this in a way previously where that was not really part of the API contract. And people started relying on that behavior that, oh, hey, like the controller service account's gonna be involved here because it's like nothing's being impersonated or whatever. And like it's talking to an external identity. But now we are adding to the API contract. Hey, there's fields in this API related to to kube auth. It's gonna exec, you know, potentially some credential plugins and all kinds of stuff. And now that we're adding fields,
uh
the behavior is gonna be
exec plugins never worked, right? Like because you have them in the kubeconfig file in the secret. If you have exec plugins there, they will fail because the binaries you were expecting don't exist in the image
people
of the
put those in
controller.
with
Yeah,
like
yeah,
init
yeah.
container.
Yeah, but the way we are implementing this feature, they can't do that kind of thing for the providers. Exec plugins are unsupported. Because in the end of the day, like how are we
Do we
implementing
break it, or is it just that we don't we don't document it as it's as supported, but it's another one of those details that just might work.
in the new feature is not supported and not documented because it's not a kube config. Like, so there's a difference. Like it's a bit of um the name does not capture exactly what we're doing with the field. So spec.kubeconfig is for remote clusters.
Hmm.
Instead of applying in the local cluster, I'm going to apply in another cluster. Right now, the only thing we support in kubeconfig is an actual kubeconfig, right? Inside a
Yeah.
secret,
Hmm.
which can or cannot have the exact plugins. People can or cannot mount the binaries in a way. whatever. So uh, we're introducing a new feature where it's not about kubeconfig. It's under the field kubeconfig because we probably don't want to create a new one, like saying remote cluster, because kubeconfig is already for a remote cluster, but is it should like let's say it should have been called spec.remote cluster or something that is
Yeah.
more about remote cluster. And one of the options of this field be related to having a kubeconfig file inside a secret, right? And then, but now we won't create like spec.remote cluster and like put the four fields um inside this other field because it's I don't know. I mean, we could actually do that, but because
Yeah,
secret
it's just
ref.
like how is like spec service kube config service account name like intended to combine
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. So
with the
regardless,
actual kube
yeah,
config behavior and like
yeah,
and
regardless if we
why is
create
it that if you don't supply one of those, you're getting controller service account behavior for the
yeah,
workload
yeah,
identity
so
stuff?
it's a matrix. It's a complicated matrix of things,
Yeah,
but
like I think the
it's
API
consistent.
is in danger
But
of
it's
being like pretty unclear and also like not uniform with like what people would expect from like
no, I
applying.
think actually there's a bit of um like so for secret and for the new feature, the way spec.service account name and spec dot whatever dot service account name is going to work. Um, sorry, yeah, for one of them it doesn't make sense. But so basically the way it works is that you get whatever is in the kube config, either a secret or workload entity. You get an identity that sends the bearer token, right? In the HTTP request to the remote cluster, the identity is in the bearer token. That's it. Or client certificates in the case of the kube config as well, right? But you have a main identity that goes in the request. Then, if you have spec.service account name specified, you impersonate with the impersonation headers of the HTTP request. This is regardless if you use the static kube config or if you use the new feature. So this behavior, at least the way how spec.service account name will behave for both things is the same. We're now introducing a new field, which is spec.something.service account name, right? That one is only going to make sense for the new feature and not for secret ref. And that one is for object level workload entity. So yes, you're right. We're gonna complicate things, but we can also solve that with documentation, right?
Feels to me that like if we're going to be adding a new authentication feature that relying on the controller service account should like do we really need to ever do that? Can people not just always provide a service account name? Like it's I can see
Well,
why you would
it,
want that, but people could provide just the same service account name. I mean, I guess if you're managing multiple clusters from different namespaces and you want it to be one identity, it just like this is a namespaced object and it's going to have like a cluster auth. And I know that this is like kind of the way that it works right now with people's hacks, right? But it like the shape of this API is different from everything that you're building with workload identity for all of the other stuff for object level.
yeah, I mean, in the terms of having spec.service account name and spec.something.service account name, indeed, this is different from everything else, but it's not different from spec.decryption.service account name, which we introduced in Flux 2.6, right? It's in line with that. We have that new field for decryption as well. So there's a parallel between spec.decryption.source account name and spec.whatever.source account name for this new feature. And there's a parallel with this new feature with spec.kubeconfig, which is remote cluster access, and the way spec.source account name is going to work with both, right?
So the
So
expectation here is with these cloud API, like external APIs, that cluster administrators should not give permission to the controller that they should not expect every single tenant to be able to access.
I mean, uh, like they can give access to the controller, like they can do controller level, no problem if they want.
Yeah, but if they do, then every tenant can access it.
Yes, and that's a decision the cluster administrator is in
Yeah,
charge of,
just an
right?
area where misconfiguration could happen, and it might be surprising. Okay.
Yeah,
Well, I
I mean,
mean,
yeah,
we
yeah.
already, what level of API did we ship the decryption feature in?
What level, what level of the API? We ship them both. Like you can use with or without spec.decryption.source account name.
In
We
in a GA API?
Yes,
So
customized
we
control.
so we can't we added a field and we to play around with it and now we can't break that.
Oh, I didn't. It was not in my intention to add it with play around mindset, to be honest.
Yeah, it's just that we used to always be able to play around with this stuff before, and now that we have GA promises, we can't anymore, right? So like the
Yeah, yeah. I'm just saying that the field wasn't something I was just playing around with. Like
yeah, and it
to
doesn't
me, it's
there's an RFC and everything, right? But it's just like if
yeah,
we ship something and people start using it, that we do not have a deprecation path when we add to
yeah.
A.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I think I mean, we actually took a long time discussing this. Like using spec.source account, introducing spec.decryption.source account name or not, and reusing spec.source account name. And I think basically the decision was customize controller customization is the only API that would have two distinct uses for source accounts. No other APIs would. So which is using for Kubernetes API, RBAC, and cloud, right? So we decided to have separate fields. Spec.source account name is what it's always been, and the new thing is spec.decryption.source account name. And we
Yeah,
were also
with
prepared to introduce the same for Kubernetes.
with key with like key decryption, um, or de with decryption keys and with I guess accessing to remote target clusters, it would be probably a pretty common desire that people would want a global configuration across namespaces. It's just owned by the infrastructure owner.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
I see the appeal of the UX, and
yeah, like I mean,
it's just
I
that
see all
the
kinds of
shape
use
of
cases.
the API being so similar to Helm release and customization, but with a but with an implicit non-opt-in behavior that defaults to cluster level or like global behavior.
It's actually opt-in, right? You have to set provider, spec.kubeconfig.provider, spec.something.provider. We're not gonna change the default functionality.
Right. That's sort of a different conversation and set of assumptions from I think I got a little bit conflated with mixing service account name with the existing spec kubectl secret ref behavior because that's just it's in the same field set.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, what we're doing
it's
is
like
that
this
it,
behavior is only, but it is very implicit, right? Like that's a default behavior when you go into provider.
yes, but that's the same, like if we imagine that there's no such thing as the middle field, right? If it's
Mhm.
just spec.provider, that's the way it works in all the other APIs. All the other APIs, if you set spec.provider to one of the cloud providers and don't specify a service account name, that's controller level workload entity, and that's how it's been for a long time before Flux 2.6.
Mhm. Like with are you thinking of
Even SOPs, right?
image
Spec dot
reflector or
yeah,
or
yeah, image reflector, everything like
yeah.
bucket, image repository, or OCI repository, Git repository for Azure, and spec.decryption for customization. If you configure decryption, uh, you you are using controller level decryption from the cloud provider.
Yeah. Cool. I'm just wrapping my head around how this really affects the posture and like the security model of the
Yeah,
project
yeah,
and like
good
the
thinking.
programming model of what the APIs promise to people. Um,
Yeah, and
it feels like we've maybe made some decisions with field names and clarity that have balanced some historical
yeah,
techniques that frankly a lot of those decisions with other like with other objects were made when neither of us were around um
yeah,
consistently. So
yeah.
uh,
But
like
like I think we're being able to fit like on how everything else works, like how we introduced spec dot provider everywhere, and then spec dot service account name everywhere, and then spec dot decryption dot service account name into dot six, and so there, if there's one thing that I have never thought about before this meeting, that due to your questions, is whether we should create spec dot remote cluster for
to
this feature.
deconflate it from kubeconfig.
Yeah, yeah, because it's
And
not
then it's like,
kubeconfig.
how should those behave when both of them are provided, right? And
Yeah,
like,
yeah, that's easy. We we don't allow both of them to be specified at the same time, and we can prevent that with cell expressions. I mean, you want to, it's one of the other. No, there's no way to use them at the same time, right? So,
yeah,
so that is so yeah. The question and decision will be around: do we create a new field for this, or do we just use spec.kubeconfig?
yeah, that is a balance there.
Yes, that's
Because it's like you're basically like getting into a field that just to disable all of its existing behavior. Like, but then it's like these things don't live separately from each other. You're either doing one or the other,
yeah,
or are
exactly.
you? Like maybe there's a provider that doesn't exist right now that will use both of them, you know? Like you must
That
provide
will
proof config
use
and also
a
like
secret,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, a
Or like
secret and a
you
provider.
want a
Yeah,
secret ref that is used by the provider.
yeah,
Maybe that's okay.
like GitHub, right? Like GitHub
Yeah.
provider in the Git repository APIs. You set provider to GitHub, and you still use a secret.
Yeah. Or MTLS
Weird.
stuff. Like this could be a place where MTLS is used. Um,
Yeah,
so
could.
we need
Yeah.
to
So, and
kind
by
of
the
flesh
way,
that out, but yeah.
maybe I should give you some details of how I'm implementing this feature since you're talking about that. So
Yeah.
how do we actually get this done? we use the same identity that you're configuring to get RBAC in the remote cluster. We use that identity to describe the cluster resource in the Cloud API as well, right? We talked about this in the past.
Yeah.
We we are doing that to get the server address, the CA, and that's it, right? Like we have for each cloud provider, we have a logic that produces a bearer token. Three things: address, CA, token. So yeah, if we're gonna support MTLS for managed service, I don't even know if you can configure a CA or whatever, like if you can configure those things. But yeah, there's that, and yeah, since you're thinking about the security posture as well, like I went through the process of checking if we could escalate privilege in this feature somehow. And that's why we have to require the clusters to be integrated with the IAM system of the cloud. That's a very important requirement,
Hmm.
which is by default in Google and Amazon. It's not by default in Azure. And if it's not enabled, this is privilege escalation because the only config you have, the only like so you have this list user credentials API for the cluster in Azure. This API gives you a kubeconfig, literally like a serialized one. And if the cluster does not have Microsoft Entra ID
Yeah.
integrated, okay,
Sorry, Mateus, we're just running up against the time block. I guess
yeah.
Augie just had to leave. If let's keep talking about this, but Fran, did you have anything that you wanted to chat about before you jump? I
No,
figured I have a meeting
no,
at the
no,
hour. Um,
nothing
no,
specific.
if you need any help or sync with FluxCon, I did not send a CFP where I am speaking at FluxCon because I figured it would be great for all of the end users and stuff to have as much stage time as possible, but I am happy to communicate to the audience at any time, for any reason. MCing, if we
Mm,
want to get all of the project maintainers up on stage, any
yeah.
of the contributors, like if Kapizawa is going to be there, he's done a bunch of work that's going into the next release, all of that kind of stuff. Like we should try to highlight the voices from the project as much as
Mm.
possible. I'm happy to help do that.
Did you have a chance to see the keynote submission? What we
No.
will
So
cover?
I don't know if I'm supposed to be looking at all of that, but if you think I should, then I'm happy to do so.
Not the actual submission, just what the intention for the day, what to cover. So fundamentally, we will cover the ecosystem as well as the roadmap. And I think there is definitely an opportunity for all the project maintainers to jump on stage, maybe at the, even at the beginning or the end of the
Yeah.
event, for like a sort of a praise.
Yeah.
100%. We're still hashing out the details for the day, but yes, indeed.
The thing that I personally like to do, just from a consistency perspective, is I love opportunities to just paint the tone of the project, right?
Mhm.
Just saying like security is important to us, right? Or the Flux API is the Kubernetes API. Like, just like these little tidbits that have been around for all of Flux's history.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
like just communicating that to new end users and stuff like that so that it gets the feel and promotes that love of the software and of the project.
Is this something you would do to set the tone in the beginning or at the end of like a final remarks?
Yeah, I with tone, right? It's you probably do a little bit of both of those things. Yeah.
But
Uh,
would you, because what we could do, and by the way, the keynote submission is not a secret, reason being, unless it violates the NCF rules, I don't think it does, but because
no.
it's a sponsored keynote, and because you're
Yes.
a control plane, you can 100% see it.
Yeah. Well, and I think with like control plane sponsoring a space for the project, right? Like, of course, there's commercial interests, but then there's also project interests, and I think
100%.
we can
And
set the schedule however we need to make
yeah.
something that really highlights Flux.
So if I share with you the skeleton of the keynote, and as a program committee defines the program for the day or for the half day,
Yeah,
we can see where would be best for the, again, maybe just for all the project contributors to be heard, or at least the ones that want to be heard.
yeah,
Mateus, you don't need to be on
yeah.
stage.
If Kingdon wants to get up
Or
and just
if
say
Kim
hi
wants,
and thanks for coming
exactly
to
that.
Flux Grub,
We,
you
we
know,
can 100% find, I mean, this is about you guys, so we can
yeah,
find exactly when the right moment is for you to say a few words.
uh-huh.
Again, could be an opening keynote as well as the final, like the day wrap up.
Perfect. Okay. I know we haven't synced about it in a little bit. Please feel free to grab time on my calendar. I really want to help.
Yeah.
So,
Getting the program committee together to start outlining how the half day will look like, it was the first step. By the way, we have so many submissions so far that we may as well ask for a full day, single track full day.
if the quality is there and the funding is there and CNCF wants to do it, then I would be happy to put in the work to make that happen.
I mean, the cost of to us won't change. The
Yeah.
sponsorship level is enough for a full day.
Okay.
It's just it's about start looking at the submissions and see, evaluating those and see if we have enough good content for a full day event.
Yeah, and if there's like themes and things that we need to be pulling out, or if we want to get in touch with some of these, you know, presenters as we select them to try and figure out how to really shape something that's going to reach the end users, then
Totally. Yeah.
okay. Well, please feel free to activate me on this. I am very willing to work on FluxCon. So
Awesome. Very
um
good. We need all the help we can get.
yeah,
Plus, most of the program committee members, you know them. I think we
yeah.
have a very good selection of a community as well as end user companies that really can judge what will be beneficial to everyone to
Yeah.
listen to in terms of talks.
Also, Mateus pinged his friend Zubair about doing a podcast with me. I need to get back to them about um, doing that, but it just more
All
PR
right.
stuff that might, fit into whatever your personal or professional priorities are. This is a
Sure.
public call, but yeah,
Critical milestone. Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I mean, critical milestones to guarantee or to ensure success was A, putting together a compelling program committee, which is done. B, getting a minimum number of submissions to make the event interesting. And I think we are like 3 times that the minimal number, so it's absolutely fine. The rest I can share with the program committee members once we meet for the first time. But yeah, let's
yeah,
talk about it.
okay,
Any
great.
satellite activities that may help. All right.
Uh, okay, sorry, Mateus. I just figured that we didn't want to lose opportunity for a friend to talk about FluxCon. Um,
Yeah,
Absolutely.
sure. Of course.
Absolutely.
No worries.
Okay. Super.
um, Great. Well, I think Mateus and I are just gonna chat about work-led identity. Feel free to stick around if you don't have
Yeah,
to jump.
I'll just observe if you don't mind.
Okay, so kind of jumping back into context. Sorry, I interrupted you, Mateus. You were thinking a little bit about the clients and config and different places where um like a even just TLS might matter for
Yeah,
talking to
I
the
mean,
cloud provider using the IAM, whatever the cloud's IAM system is, getting cluster information, whether or not the CA should be swappable, that kind of thing.
yeah. So like my main concern was, and I described in that thread that we discussed in the Flux maintenance channel, and also probably in one of the past calls, is if you could escalate privileges, right? And in the context of Azure, you we're giving like the API that we use, which is list user credentials or something, gives you back a kubeconfig. That kubeconfig is cluster admin when the cluster is not integrated with Microsoft Entra ID, with AAD, right? So I have an if that literally like errors out if like when I describe the cluster, there's a field that tells me if the integration is enabled or not. And if it's not, I reject that cluster. No,
Oh,
we won't
that's
support.
interesting.
Yeah.
Um, I think that that's fair. Um,
Hmm.
so is there a reason why we wouldn't use that kube config and use our cluster admin privileges to impersonate the service account that's already described by the customization? Because I
You
think
can
that
do that.
that's
That looks valid.
because I think that that's what we do.
Mm,
Later, friend.
by
Like
fun.
that's whenever we use spec kube config, that's the effective ID in the target cluster, or at least I think that that's the intention.
Yeah,
Hopefully.
yeah. So you can combine, yeah, you could combine spec.source account name with that, right? Like, okay, I have this cluster admin config that Azure gave me for
Hmm.
this cluster. And then I use spec.source account name to impersonate this source account and namespace of, so it's weird, right? Like
Yeah.
that's how it works. That's how it documentedly works
For kube
in
config,
for a kubeconfig.
we
You
should
sorry?
probably emulate. We should think about emulating that behavior in at least some, if not all cases.
Yeah, I mean we can support the same in this in workload entity, but it's even before like just for a kubeconfig secret, it's kind of weird because what how does it work? Is like the the service account name is a service account that
In
has to
another
exist
cluster.
in the target cluster,
Yeah.
but the namespace is the namespace of the customization in the source cluster.
Yeah, I mean it's like we had to give some people some sort of segmentation knob. Um, and
Yeah.
it's really when we introduce target cluster, like the behavior is the same as if Flux is talking to the cluster that it's in, right? It's just that the target cluster is implicit and you know where to go. Um, but like Kubernetes service account impersonation is always a function of the cluster that you're talking to. Um, and it's like so now you get into a state in which RBAC in which Flux is being controlled in the source cluster is not related to the RBAC in the target cluster. But if you have some way of provisioning RBAC in the target cluster, you now can use service account name to drop privileges on target cluster, right? So
Yeah, because you ensure the existence of the namespace
yeah,
forever.
right. Like you can cluster admin your way into provisioning whatever you want on the target cluster, but you can always also add a depends on with another customization that drops privileges, right? And like that's really intentional so that like you could do a hub and spoke model where like there's only one Flux and you have 100 clusters and
Yeah.
like there's 10 dev teams per cluster and it works. Like you can still drop
Yeah, you
privileges.
can do multi-tenancy in remote clusters that don't have Flux installed because you
Yes.
do hub and spoke, right?
Yeah. Um, and like people do this with like V cluster, right? Where like the V clusters don't have flux. But then you target cluster into the V cluster and you you give the, tenants. And how should this work? Because the workload identity stuff, or like having an IAM, what do we call it? Having some principal, some IAM principal user, a cloud user.
Mhm. I
People
call it
assign,
cloud identity.
yeah, a cloud identity. People assign Kubernetes RBAC privileges to effective cloud identities. And
Mhm.
the kubeconfig, with the kubeconfig implementation, it's like really clear to somebody. Like, okay, the service account name that's being used is implicit based off of the customization API, right? It uses spec service account name. And the only thing that you're usually working with is like some sort of effective Kubernetes service user. Um, but when you auth with the cloud identity, your user probably won't be a namespace service account. It's going to be some cloud preventer identity email, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Which already can have RBAC.
yes,
So spec that service account name. No, you have the cloud identity needs RBAC that can impersonate the other RBAC.
which is pretty privileged and a little bit of a pain to set up if you are forced to use service account name, right? Like if that's just the implicit behavior that's forced on you when you're using this provider, right? You almost want like a flag to turn on whether or not you're going to do that. Um,
To
and maybe
use
it
the
should be on
spec
by
that service
default,
account name.
huh?
To use spec that service account name.
Yeah, and then it's like, how does it behave when both service account names are provided? Now it's getting really weird.
Yeah. So it's complex, but there's logic on it. So like the service account inside the field is how you get a cloud identity. The
Yes,
cloud identity is responsible for two things: describing the cluster resource, for getting the CA, etc., the address, and for having RBAC inside the cluster. Two things: describing RBAC. This is the spec.kubeconfig.search account. Spec.search account is then something we impersonate using the RBAC of the cloud identity. Two levels of it's complex. It's not simple. Like it's gonna be
would we
hard to write in
expect
docs.
that RBAC, that cloud provider ID would have, would frequently be an administrator of the cluster? I feel like if somebody is doing this, they probably wouldn't, right? Like they might even restrict it to a namespace.
So you're saying people will often not have reason to use spec.search account name in this case.
I could see like somebody's gonna have to make that cloud provider ID. Right. This is a talented end user of Flux who is doing this.
Yeah.
Like, are they
Who's
just
doing
gonna
all
give
of
that
that,
thing
right?
admin? No, right? Like probably not, unless Flux forces them to. And it's like these cloud provider RBAC policies, like they're not granular. It's like like give it like this, like is it like a namespace user or is it like okay, does it have read access or not? You know? So
We
it's
we
like
could one alternative is not allowing use of spec.search account name when spec.kubeconfig.provider is specified with a value different than generic. That's one alternative for sure to simplify things, right? And then you say the cloud identity that you will use inside the cluster with RBAC because there's integration
Hmm.
has to have everything you need. And you still have two levels of doing that, right? You still have controller level workload identity and object level. You could have, if you're looking into setting controller level, then that cloud identity will most likely be cluster admin inside the cluster, right? I suppose.
It's
I
annoying, like, because being able to segment on the service account is like a really important feature of the Flux programming model. Like, it's how you, as
yeah.
the person creating customizations and Helm releases, drop privileges as you naturally
Yeah.
traverse a tree of dependencies. And like at the same time, like making cloud provider IDs is also super annoying. Like whereas like when you're in Kubernetes land, it's all GitOps, right? Um, like oftentimes these cloud provider IDs are going to come from a shell script, or from a spreadsheet that they give to another team. Like I need this thing, right? And it's like that's just a like managing cloud stuff is often not even the responsibility of the platform team. Like it's owned by some other team that they're trying to that some director is making these people work with. And then this platform team is just scrambling to create a platform interface that's going to work for, 30 dev teams or something. Um, so it's like there's like the two use cases. And it's like if the behavior is not there, it's going to be annoying to one of these people. Um,
Yeah.
like like they're the people who have like full control like over that workload identity and they can make as many of them as they want and they can split them up and assign RBAC and whatever and then there's the people who like and relying on that cloud provider feature to give you everything you need for RBAC is also a little bit of a slippery slope because it's like what the heck is the cloud provider doing to give you access for this cloud provider ID in Kubernetes? They are putting stuff like in your cluster, right? Like like naturally there has to be some role bindings like in that. Or everybody is effectively cluster admin, uh, and then but they're filtering it, through a cloud provider gateway. Um, do you see what I'm getting at there? Like like cloud provider RBAC for Kubernetes is not precise.
Yeah, I mean, I have an idea of how it's implemented, but you're talking about the use cases, right? When it's used and how.
Yeah, I'm saying the cloud implementation for the AP, yeah, I'm like mixing a lot of concerns, right? The cloud provider implementation is probably limited and imprecise compared to just relying on Kubernetes for RBAC. And then from a use case perspective, there are probably some people who will want to use the cloud provider RBAC and they can make as many identities as they want, and that is their level of segmentation. But it feels to me like the behavior that is already there for other use cases, like target kubectl and the regular Flux in cluster stuff.
So
Like,
maybe you're like reaching a conclusion where um what if we give people a way to acquire an admin, like a cluster admin level of access by default, and then tell people to use spec.service account name to drop permissions like they normally would if they are not talking to a remote cluster, which is exactly the case, right? Like if you're not talking to a remote cluster, what customized controller does is
Mhm.
it uses cluster admin if you don't specify spec.source account name. But if you do, then it uses that source account in the namespace of the customization,
Oh,
right?
is that what we do with kubeconfig?
No. That's I'm talking the setup where we don't talk to remote cluster. There's no remote cluster. No remote cluster. Okay.
Okay.
Like no remote cluster, what happens is customization API uses cluster admin from customized controller, right? With by default. If you specify spec.source account name, then customized controller will impersonate that for the apply. So you start with an admin kubeconfig or an admin cluster admin level. And if you specify source account, you drop permissions. So I think what you're saying kind of suggests that we could consider
Yeah.
an implementation where we give the same kind of behavior, but for a remote cluster, which means you get cluster admin by default in the remote cluster. And then if you use spec.source account name, you drop permissions, right?
It looks
That
like
would be
that's
the,
actually the behavior that already exists for kubeconfig. I think we made a trade-off here where
but that's not,
oftentimes,
unfortunately, that's not the case, right? Because the kubeconfig could have a token for a source account that is not cluster admin.
okay, I see what you're getting at. Where it's like kind of controlled by what comes back to you as
Yeah,
opposed to what's being offered. So I'm just looking at the field behavior right now that exists for kubeconfig secret ref. And basically, yeah, it talks about how it's similar to cluster API. When both spec kubeconfig and spec service account name are specified, the controller will impersonate the service account on the target cluster.
Mhm. And
That's, I think we made a trade-off here where it's like if it's not specified, whatever that means, right? Like we basically are preventing, we're actually like there's no such thing as like a whether or not a field is specified, right? Like in Kubernetes, like the field always has a value.
yeah, I mean, when service account name is not empty string,
Then
then you just use the kubeconfig as is with whatever is inside. Can be cluster admin, cannot, can be anything,
so we
including
already have
exec
this.
plugins,
Sorry.
including exec plugins if people do those things.
Okay. So the flag is already there, is my I what I didn't realize. Like for kubeconfig behavior for secrets,
Yeah.
we already have an opt-in.
Yeah,
So it doesn't impersonate by default.
yes, it does. So that's why I was saying that the implementation I came up with as a
Yeah.
suggestion, like, is it's kind of the same thing as kubeconfig, right? You have
Yeah.
whatever access level you have with the cloud identity, and
Mhm.
then you can also impersonate
So why throw away the cluster admin kubeconfig?
in Azure, right?
Yeah.
Because so you don't have to, because Azure is the only place where you can have the cluster not integrated with the IAM system, right? in the other uh clouds, it's by default, the integration. It's not something you can turn on and off. And in none of the others, you get a kubeconfig that is cluster admin with described cluster access. You know,
Normally, you have your IAM user.
yes,
And what
like you,
RBAC, like the cloud RBAC is what controls that, and then they put role bindings inside your cluster or do something to give you
yeah,
access.
it's just something that works. Like it's how authentication works in Kubernetes. Like you can use a webhook on the API server that will call something somewhere and say, oh, this is the string that represents the user or identity inside the cluster.
Yeah, and
And
then
then
there must be
that's seamlessly integrated with Kubernetes RBAC. As long like whatever you grunt inside the cluster to that string will just work.
yeah, but what I'm getting at is that they're putting other bindings in the cluster for that string.
Yes, but that's like that's not by default. Like you don't, let's say you create a GCP service account today, right? And you have a GK cluster. Before you connecting these two things together somehow, that string, like the email of this GCP service account, already like I can't create an RBAC like I can create a role and role binding for the email of the GCP service account in my GK cluster, and that would just work. Like if I use a token for like a Google Access token for GCP service account, I will have that RBAC. Like you don't have to connect the two things, like you connect the two things by creating the RBAC inside the cluster.
Yeah, yeah. What I'm getting at is just like whether the cloud provider does that for you automatically or if you need to
Yeah,
do that.
it's automatically like boom, you have a GK cluster that works. Like you have a GCP service account, you
I
have a
don't
GK cluster.
think we're, I don't think you are hearing me talking about the same thing that you're talking about. Like I know how I know how authentication and authorization are separate in Kubernetes API. RBAC is an authorization API. It has nothing to do with authentication. So if you authenticate with whatever principal string, you will get whatever you are authorized for. And authorization is something that is controlled by the API owner. So I understand that those two things are very separate, and that if you authorize a string and somebody authenticates as that string, that there's a link there. And nobody has to do anything in any cloud API to make that work. That's a Kubernetes thing.
Mhm.
Um, but like I think what I'm teasing out here is typically with a or with some cloud identity, if you give it access to authenticate with a Kubernetes API, cloud providers also typically have authorization stuff, and they magically sync that authorization stuff in with the Kubernetes API, and that involves either
I am not
assuming that thing.
aware of any features like that for Google and for EKS. I am not
So
aware.
so in Google
In
and
Azure, there's
EKS,
something like that.
what you've seen is what?
So what I have seen like is um Azure, like I think the other two cloud providers also have the same thing, but in Azure, you have a thing called Azure RBAC. What does that mean? Azure RBAC is granting Azure roles to a managed identity,
Yeah,
and that reflects as permission inside the cluster.
yeah,
There's some sort of conversion,
yeah,
right?
yeah. They have
This feature,
their fleet manager.
I am pretty sure there's probably similar features in. I actually saw that for GCP. I saw the same feature for GCP and GK.
Hmm.
I didn't check for Amazon. But those features are entirely optional and are not enabled by default. So what I'm saying is, imagine in AKS cluster, you have a managed identity. This managed identity, the RBAC this managed identity will have is the sum or the union of whatever you assign yourself in the cluster for the principal of this managed identity and Azure RBAC.
Yeah.
Neither are neither exist by default, and neither requires some sort of sorry, in Azure it requires, not in the other clouds. In Azure you can only have Azure RBAC if the cluster is integrated with Microsoft Enter ID. So in clusters that are not integrated with Microsoft Enter ID, Azure RBAC is not possible. But for example, in Google, in GK, you have a GK cluster, you have a GCP service account. You have two ways of granting RBAC to the service account inside the cluster. You can either do it via Kubernetes RBAC yourself with cluster roles and role bindings
You
and
find the
etc.
email in your Terraform thing, and then yeah.
Yeah, you can just do that.
Yeah.
Or you can grant GCP IAM roles to the GCP service account. And both things can be done independently and do not need any sort of turn on feature to be turned on.
I would be inclined to say that when we get that cluster admin kubeconfig in the AKS case, that we would not reject it. That might sound surprising, but I think just from a,
But do you know why I decided to reject? Do you have a guess?
did it surprise you that that it came back as admin? Or why do we need to reject that?
Yeah, so my take on why we need to reject that is the problem I was talking about in that thread.
Privilege
It,
escalation?
privilege escalation. Why is that? Because if in my namespace I can spin up a pod to use the cloud identity that has access to the kube config, boom, I am. Wait a minute. You could argue, the tenant is yours, right? You can
Yeah.
spin up a pod with that identity. That identity has access to get a cube, a cluster admin cube config for the cluster,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So
A
you
dangerous
could argue
configuration.
that.
But this is also kind of the typical output of cluster API is a cluster admin kubeconfig. Like that's why we have the service account opt-in for people to drop privileges is it's like this is typically the place where a cluster admin kubeconfig is expected in a cluster API context.
Yeah, because it's less configuration, right? In Azure, like in Azure, what would I imagine? So if people were using this feature with spec.service account name, what I imagine that I would see would be people making the cloud identity be cluster admin, such that it can drop permissions with spec.service account name, right? So
Yeah.
people would, so in Azure, you would have to enable the integration, which is not by default. Should
Mhm.
be, by the way, you can't come back if you enable, you can't come back to disable in a cluster. You have to delete the cluster. So imagine that at some point you will not be able to create clusters without the integration at all. That's what I
Mhm.
imagine. And then in this case, so Azure, so yeah, we can basically remove the if I put in the code and allow
Mhm.
whatever Azure is doing on their side, right?
Yeah. Like if it feels particularly different from other providers, you could have a provider specific log, or like that like has like a high verbosity warning if
Mm,
people have verbose logging enabled. But I mean,
mm. I just remembered another reason why, like, I added to the reasons of why I decided to do this, which is the duration of the credential. So in Google, what Google is amazing is most, like, I don't know, man, like, GCP is my favorite.